Downward Thrust released an overview of the Total War franchise recently. I, and many others judging from the comments, found his video to be incredibly misinformed. I like Downward Thrust, and usually his content is on point with its information, which is why it's so jarring for his video to be this incorrect. The Total War games definitely have their fair share of problems, but the issues DT was listing were either vastly over-exaggerated, or just completely false. You can see a lot of discontent from viewers in the like-dislike bar and in the comment section below, with even another popular YouTuber commenting there. For many of Downward Thrust's viewers, this will be their first major exposure to the Total War games. This video serves to correct a lot of the erroneous statements DT made on his overview. If you haven't already, please go watch Downward Thrust's original video, which will be linked in the description. Little addendum before we begin, I haven't played Shogun or Medieval 1, so I can't comment on his statements there, nor do I have enough playtime on Warhammer to feel comfortable correcting someone else's statements about it. This video will be focusing from Rome 1 to Rome 2 for the most part, which spans the majority of the game's entries and DT's video. With that preface out of the way, let's begin. Starting on a positive, nothing DT said about Rome Total War was unwarranted defamation, so we're good there. He claimed the trait that made Rome so great was its system of consequences for actions, whether positive or negative. I'd say it was the grand scale of the battles combined with a diverse unit and faction roster, but that's not important. The important thing to note is that Rome is the game that garnered Creative Assembly the fame it has today. Medieval 2 is where Downward Thrust statements just become baffling. First point DT made is that Medieval 2 is basically just a graphical upgrade from Rome with a different skin. That has some merit to it, as a lot of major elements from Rome 1 to Medieval 2 weren't or were barely changed, but there are also some noticeable improvements. The game had multi-core support, running much better as a result. A dichotomy was introduced to settlements where the player had to decide between building a castle for high-quality military troops or a town for high-income grossing buildings. The recruitment system was changed so more than one unit could be trained per turn at each settlement, but limitations were placed so high-end troops couldn't be mass spammed. The trait system for generals saw a hefty improvement where actions would determine how chivalrous or dreadful they were. Religious obstacles from the papacy and invasions from the Mongols were introduced to prevent players from steamrolling enemy factions. The battles in general were slowed down thanks to the heavy armor soldiers wore in comparison to Rome 1, making the expensive knights determine the outcome of a lot of battles since their charges could break an enemy formation. I think Medieval 2 is a great sequel. When browsing the internet for arbitrary opinionated lists, you'll find the plurality of fans find Medieval 2 to be the best of the series. Once again, not without its flaws, but a damn good game. So, what were DT's critiques? He starts off by saying religious conversion was biased towards the Catholics over every other religion. I can't really refute that without saying, no, that's just flat out wrong. Religious conversion rates are determined by the piety stats of your ministers in the region and the quality of the church or mosque or whatever building is in the region. It works the same for every faction, so I don't know how DT came to the conclusion that the game was biased towards the Catholics. I suspect his playthrough had him start with high-level priests, and/or he built churches as much as possible. The only thing Catholics have over other nations is the Pope, who can be convinced to call a crusade against a non-Catholic faction. Even so, Muslims can call a jihad, which works similarly to a crusade. Religion worked the same for each faction, serving as an element that could be a nuisance to a player that was terrible at managing it, and advantageous to a player that knew how to utilize his or her priests and imams. The next statement DT made is a complaint that the campaign AI is blatantly too simple when in the late game. That is kind of, sort of, true to a degree? I would describe the campaign AI as inconsistent at any period of the game. It will usually attack with a large army and use its generals effectively. On the flip side, it occasionally sends this pitiful force against your armies while its generals just sit away in a settlement far away from the front. The AI has been, and is, one of the greatest shortcomings of the Total War franchise. Even so, I would say Medieval 2's AI sort of rides the line of passable, with it usually working and then acting like it has had a full frontal lobotomy from time to time. It never pulls off ingenious tactics while in battle, nor uses its armies in the most efficient manner, but it works. Mostly. Okay, so this next point is probably the most head-scratching for me. DT says, units that didn't take orders stood around like fools, or just ran wherever they wanted to. Now, if you've played a Total War, you're probably as equally bewildered as I am, but I think I know why Downward Thrust stated what he did. The units stand around like fools issue DT has is probably a comparison he's drawing with other RTSs, where units will move slightly to engage units within their line of sight. That way you don't have to constantly macro units to move 2 feet. The problem is, a system like that would be terrible for Total War game. Total War games revolve around units standing in formations, holding certain positions. If they broke a formation every time something occurred, that would be terrible. It would leave them susceptible to cavalry charging in at their loose formations, or getting hit with projectiles while not properly braced. Units in the Total War games don't break formation for every small occurrence because that is what works best with the game's mechanics. There is one exception to this, which I believe is conducive to him believing some units go wherever they want to, and that is the specific units that may charge without orders. Some units, most commonly knights and other fanatical units, have a trait that states they may charge without orders. This was made so these elite units could be baited out. It requires the player using these fanatical units to keep a watchful eye out, making sure their forces don't randomly charge. It's a gameplay mechanic, not an issue. It draws you into the world a little bit. Knights want glory, so they may charge without command. Religious fanatics want to serve their god, so they might charge without orders. It's an intentional game design decision. Of the 3 negatives Downward Thrust brought up for Medieval 2, only one of them is meritable. I have a strong feeling he just didn't play enough Medieval 2 to truly get a grasp on what the problems of the series were, and just went off an hour or two of play. If anyone who hasn't played Medieval 2 is wondering what the actual issues are, I would say it's the lack of unit diversity compared to Rome 1, the AI, the game balance, and how poorly a lot of information is presented to the player. The expansion for Medieval 2, called Kingdoms, fixed a lot of the balancing issues, but the way the game presents information to the player wasn't. For example, some units have a bonus fighting cav stat. Okay, so what exactly does that do? Is it an attack multiplier? Is it a flat bonus of +5 to their attack skill? What? Units have 3 different types of defense attributes, but it's kind of unclear what each one does, which one's the best, what does what. Here's one for you Medieval 2 veterans. Did you know there's a discipline stat that affects morale? Did you know, to my knowledge, the game never ever mentions this stat even though it's kind of important? I don't expect people to find out a lot of the intricacies of Rome and Medieval 2 without just looking it up online or playing for an absurd amount of time. Medieval 2's sequel, Empire, would fix this issue by taking the easy way out and just removing a litany of features and heavily streamlining others. Probably the most perplexing game of all the games DT covered in this video was Empire, not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't say. He did a basic summary of the game, then made one critique. That critique was that you made too much money from taxes in the late game, which could be true, but it would have required a high tax rate, which in turn would have required the player to keep unrest in their cities down to a minimum, which was difficult to do with a high tax rate. But it's a valid complaint. He sort of over-exaggerates, but it's valid. The problem I have is how he completely glosses over the massive elephant in the room with Empire, and that is how the game launched completely and utterly broken. If you somehow managed to get Empire running at launch, you were greeted with the worst AI Total War has ever seen. It would attack your entire army with one unit. It would send its general, alone, into firing range of your units. And that's assuming it didn't just stand there doing nothing for an entire battle. Units would glitch out and get caught on random debris. Soldiers would fire outside their range, missing every shot. Animation and graphical bugs were numerous. And on top of all that, the game was streamlined so much that many elements were now completely uninteresting. Generals now only had one trait. No more checking your general's loyalty, using certain generals as administrators, releasing prisoners to make your generals more chivalrous. Nothing. Settlements became bare bones with barely any decision making being involved in the building process. The game toned down the presence of agents. Where once clever use of ministers, spies, and assassins could have a settlement overthrow its current owners, was now a strategy that was a shell of its former self. What we had at the launch of Empire was a skeleton of a campaign compared to previous Total Wars, and completely broken battles. The game was unplayable, and Creative Assembly effectively shattered the trust of so many of their fans. By the way, in case you ever need confirmation on how completely useless mainstream review outlets are, check out Empire's Metacritic score. Eventually, a lot of the bugs would be fixed, though some are still present. And there were some improvements from Roman Medieval. Ranged units would now show their range. Units now had a morale bar above them, which made checking to see if a unit was going to rout far quicker than before. But all the little changes didn't compensate for the fact that us consumers received an unplayable mess. I'll make a modern analogy for how broken Empire was, with another popular game. Downward Thrust, me, and many are fond of The Witcher 3 and CD Projekt Red. Now imagine if CDPR had released The Witcher 3 where it crashed half the time you booted it up, the game froze randomly upon triggering certain quests, and Geralt became stuck in place for 10 seconds when doing certain spells. Now imagine a good chunk of these bugs were never fixed. I highly doubt CDPR would have become the favorite developer for many, despite riding on the success of 2 beloved predecessors to The Witcher 3. That's basically what happened with Empire and Creative Assembly. It boggles my mind how Downward Thrust never mentioned the dilapidated state Empire was in at launch. My only thoughts is that he didn't know because he didn't play the game at launch, and he didn't perform any research on the game. Napoleon, Empire's direct sequel, was a far better game, if not just by the account that it was actually functional at launch. It was still full of bugs that would get patched out, but compared to Empire's launch, it seemed like a jewel of polish. The game fixed a lot of Empire's issues. Napoleon was much better balanced, the minimap became easier to read, the campaign was kept interesting in the late game since there was always 5 massive nations for most of the game, with France being a looming threat for every coalition member. Still, at the same time, a lot of problems from Empire persisted. Soldiers in Napoleon Empire kind of glide around and act like they have no weight. In melees, formations crumble while soldiers slide over to attack, sometimes even phasing through each other. This is in harsh contrast to Rome and Medieval 2, where individuals had obvious mass and there's a clear line for each formation. You could tell what unit was winning an engagement by how one gained ground over the other. Empire and Napoleon both suffer from a problem where one man from a unit could get caught in something, which would prevent the entire line from firing, despite everyone else being in formation. This might be a problem with the way individuals are synced up with their formations, since they unnaturally perform many actions together with perfect timing. Compare how a line fires in Empire and Napoleon to these crossbowmen in Medieval 2. The crossbowmen shoot independently from each other. In Napoleon, one guy reloading can hold up the other 50 from firing. Napoleonic units fired by rank, but I doubt it was to the point where 199 men allowed themselves to get shot because the 200th man was stuck reloading. With all that being said, Napoleon is still an improvement over Empire. Though a lot of people prefer the vastness of Empire's campaign, multiplayer is still strong on Napoleon. There's quite a few multiplayer mods for Napoleon. The most popular from what I can gather are the La Montée de l'Empire and Napoleon Total War 3 mods, so give those a try if you're interested. Funny enough, Empire's most popular mod is Darth Mod, the one that fixes the AI. I digress. I went off a bit longer on Empire and Napoleon than previous games, and that is just to serve my point, which is, unlike what Downward Thrust said, Napoleon is not just Empire with a narrow focus and generals that are based off actual people. At least in the battle department, it's an improvement over Empire, both in functionality and balance. Shogun 2 is probably the most polished the series has ever been. Not only were many bugs that plagued previous Total War games gone, so many design decisions that improved the game were implemented. The problem I have with DT's segment on Shogun 2 is that he doesn't mention any of the major improvements Shogun 2 made. The player was now given a goal in the campaign other than just conquer the world, and didn't steamroll every other faction in the late game. There was actual complexity behind settlements again. Agents could once again be recruited manually, and had larger roles than they did before. Battles were given this intricate rock-paper-scissors style, which made correct composition as crucial as ever. Information was, albeit ungracefully, provided to the player with a goddamn encyclopedia. If the player was ever confused, they had the tools available to answer their question. The team even assembled small FMVs for each unit so the player would be familiar with their strengths and weaknesses. Downward Thrust statements that Shogun 2 is great since it portrayed feudal Japan beautifully, and that it was more difficult to appease settlements, aren't giving the game enough credit, especially considering it succeeded 2 games of copious bugs and failed streamlining. So many elements were improved, and DT is right that many consider this their favorite Total War. Sadly, all good things must come to an end. Contrarily to what DT said, Rome 2 was not the first game to have a Blood and Gore DLC. That BS practice starts with Shogun 2, sadly. Rome 2 was completely and utterly broken, but this was not the first time Crave Assembly had released an unfinished game. This wasn't the game that broke the franchise's trust with CA, rather, it's what reaffirmed it for so many people. Shogun 2 made people hopeful that Creative Assembly had learned their lesson with releasing broken games. That Empire was just broken because CA was working both with a completely new engine and a new form of warfare. Rome 2 had neither of those excuses, which, in my opinion, made it even more damning for the game to have been that buggy, to have ran so poorly, and for the AI to have been as retarded as it was. The statement that the UI is more complicated than previous Total War games is kind of true, I guess. It's more that the UI is just worse. It's more difficult to read and communicates less, making it far less efficient than previous installments. Removing the family tree wasn't a positive change. Shogun 2 reintroduced the family tree successfully with proper management of your generals actually influencing the game again. Sending your general, your family member, into battle and seeing him cut down was heartbreaking. It built tension. Rome 2 removed this in favor of a weird system where you would raise a leader to lead a legion, and in my opinion, it's inferior to allowing full control of your armies and allowing a family member to head the army for some morale bonuses. Situations where your general is in danger carry much less gravitas when one can simply hire a new general, rather than having the generals be a finite resource limited by the amount of male offspring from your family tree. Quickly covering Attila, Downward Thrust makes the claim that Attila improved upon Rome 2 by adding the mechanics of religion, technology, food supplies, and government offices in order to prevent strife and civil war. The problem is, literally every one of those facets was in the previous game. Not all of them were executed to decent success, but they were there. Shogun 2 even had all these features as well. The conclusion that Attila was a pleasant surprise for Total War fans isn't really accurate either. It's not hated by any means, but a lot of people still prefer Rome 2 over Attila, especially after Rome 2 was fixed. The only other statement DT made on Attila is that it felt like survival, which is a tone felt by many factions across multiple Total War games. Once again, it feels like Downward Thrust didn't play the game enough to accurately cover it, since everything he mentions in Attila was in previous installments. I'm not going to respond to Downward Thrust's comments on Warhammer, except one. DT said combining Warhammer and Total War was really bizarre. Why? In a tabletop game about controlling units on a battlefield, making a video game with the same premise seems fitting. Not much of a counter-argument, just puzzled by his statement. That's pretty much it. Downward Thrust wanted his viewers to leave a comment on their thoughts on his video. I went a little further with an idiotically long video response. As I said in the beginning, Downward Thrust's content is normally better than this, so don't assume this is the status quo for him. If you have any questions on the Total War franchise, leave a comment below and I will try to get to it. If you like the video, like it. If you dislike the video, dislike it and report it for hate speech. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope to see you for the next one.